What's up, YouTube? I'm Chris, and I'm back. And today, I'm going to be telling you how I made this kick drum for Collider. It sounds something like this. Okay, so what I've done here is I've turned off all of the master bus processing effects, and I've also totally turned off all of the drum bus effects. And so I'm just giving you the kick sound raw. So one thing I like to do when I make drum sounds like a kick or a snare, sometimes I'll bring in a sample, which is what I've done here. This wasn't part of the original project, but I brought it in just as an example. This is from a sample pack by a guy by the name of Crispy Dinner. So I found his stuff on freesound.org a long time ago, and he has some pretty good examples of like EDM kicks and snares and stuff, like stuff that would be really good for glitch hop or in this case neurofunk. And they're kind of these somewhat over the top, kind of like super processed drum sounds, but they sound great. I think he did a good job with them. So I'll link to them in the description. But anyways, this is the sound of his kick. And then my kick. So I like his sound a little bit better, but I came up with something that worked decently well for this track, given that it was kind of a neurofunk thing with One Synth. So what you're going to notice is, let's just get right into it. I'm going to turn off all the master bus effects on the kick. So I have a bunch of effects on the kick bus, which I'll talk about. And let's just go through the individual layers. So just like all my other sounds, the kick is built out of layers of different sounds. So the first sound is this one. Okay, so that sound is just made by turning on a bunch of oscillators, turning the sync on, cranking this pitch envelope knob all the way up, which, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure what that does. I can kind of hear the difference, which I'll show you in a second. I've got the filter cut off all the way down, and I'm adding some of the envelope to it, and I'm just having a really quick attack and a little bit of decay on that to kind of get that doof doof, that kind of low sound. And I'm looking for something that's hitting around an 80 to 100 hertz kind of area. So one way I start with these sounds is I often just start with like a synth bass patch. So to be honest with you, if I turn the cutoff up, it kind of sounds like a really resonant synth bass and almost like kind of cheesy one from like an 80s movie or something. If I turn the pitch envelope down, so it is doing a little bit of something. This synth doesn't have one of the traditional, ADSR pitch envelopes that I'm kind of used to. So I kind of had to play with this to get it the way I wanted it. So this is probably the sound that I made. It's got some resonance in it. Without the resonance, it sounds even a little more percussive. But you need the resonance for this kind of low sound. So this sound's supposed to be kind of like the low part of the kick, like the boom, boom, like the boom of it. So then what I do is I then layer it with, oh, I'm sorry, I need to go back to the effects on this. So I applied a channel EQ, peaked at 60 hertz, probably just audibly thought that was where it needed a little help. And then, of course, if you guys have watched my other videos, you know that I absolutely love this built-in overdrive plugin of Logic's. And then I am really working the W1 limiter. This guy, the threshold is dialed almost all the way to the minimum, and I really want the limiter to come in and just really crank on the sound. So without the effects, it sounds like this. Pretty weak. And what you're going to notice is the EQ gets a lot of this sub-frequency with the effects. So a lot tighter and a lot beefier, and that's exactly what I want for a sound like this. Okay, the next sound is what I called WWOOF, and I kind of ripped off this trick from this guy called Seamless. If you've not seen his videos on YouTube, he's an FL Studio kind of guru, and he's a monster at synthesis. You should go check out his videos. I'll link to them in the description. And he has a video about how he synthesizes kicks using FM synthesis. And this is one of his tricks, is to create this like woof, which sounds like this. Barely audible. Go turn this guy back down. Turn this woof all the way up here. So what this woof is doing is it's taking up a little bit of this low mid area. So the main body of the kick's down here, and I wanted something to kind of fill it in, and it's sort of supposed to simulate like the air inside the drum. And so this sound is made very similar. I backed off the pitch envelope. It just as a standard sine wave. Got a little bit of the cutoff open, and I basically did this by ear just to try to get that low mid. It's not really an impressive sound, but it's just a part of the layer. And again, all these effects are on, and I've got the silver verb. This is a pretty simple reverb in Logic, just adding a little bit more air to the sound. And then I'm using a limiter to really crank the gain of the sound up because it's a very soft sound. So if I turn off all the effects, it's barely audible. Turn them back on. You get that kind of low mid sound that I was looking for. All right. So then I layered that with a hi-hat. So those of you that know a little bit about electronic music, whatever, know there's often a trick where, especially like in trance, guys will layer like a hi-hat sample with the kick to kind of give it more high energy impact. That trick seems to work pretty well for a tune like this too, that's got a lot of sound elements in it, and it just helps the kick kind of punch through just a tiny bit more. So if I play this kick hat, hold on, let me go back and re-volume the woof back. The woof. Don't want too much woof. All right. So this hat sound, you can see it's occupying the highest frequencies of the kick. And this is just your standard noise oscillator cranked all the way up. And I'm just applying the full envelope on the cutoff. Sorry. Oh, I see the problem. I've got this. So it's kind of like your classic synthesized open hat sound, and then like closed hat. The problem with this setting though is you end up getting some of the sine wave in there, and I crank these frequencies all the way up to get the sound I wanted. Watch what happens if I turn the effects off. Get this piercing note way up here, and it's just really nasty. So what I've done is going through the overdrive, just to give it a little bit more oomph. A compressor, which isn't, I don't think, doing a lot. Just kind of tickling the sound. And then I'm using a channel EQ to get rid of all the low frequency info. Excuse me. And then get rid of that nasty guy up there. And it seems to work. And I've reused this sound all over the track. Okay. Turn him back down. Okay, and then finally what I called the snap. So you can see the snap is, I've got the spec can open over here. You guys can see kind of what these sounds look like in the spectrum. The snap is occupying kind of the higher mid. And so that kind of rounds out the sound. And the snap is, I'm trying to create like a sound that makes it like when the mallet hits the head of the drum, kind of like that sound, that snappiness. This is a little over the top for my taste, but you know, at some point you got to stop tweaking on this stuff and actually make a tune. And this is what I came up with. So again, I've got the noise cranked all the way up. I've got a little less decay on the volume envelope and a little of the attack. So without the attack, with attack turned up too high, the sound disappears. With the attack on the filter envelope turned up, you just start opening that filter up. So it's just kind of this whoosh, whoosh, kind of silly, ridiculous thing. But with it closed, you get a kind of nice snap. And again, this is all driven with a noise oscillator just to make a really percussive kind of sound. Without the plugins, it's a really high-pitched, noisy thing. It's got quite a bit of this sub in here. And I'll just show you the channel EQ. I'm just using the channel EQ to just select what of the spectrum that I want to use for the sound. So all in all, not too difficult. All right, so let's talk about the main kick bus. So this is what it sounds like without the effects on the bus on. Sorry. So it sounds kind of terrible, and that's one point I want to make is I mix all of these sounds into this bus. If you're not familiar with mixing sounds into a bus, go check out other tutorials, but the idea is to apply some effects on a bus and then kind of push all these sounds into it to kind of make them one cohesive sound. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm actually using this overdrive plugin as a compressor to kind of bring the sounds in and glue them together. So we had this. And now with the overdrive, of course, that's much louder, so it obviously is going to sound better, even though I really technically should turn it down. But it's giving a lot more harmonics to the sound. And to my ears, that already sounds a lot better. Then I'm using the W1 limiter again as kind of effect. Without it, the kick is more of a fishbone looking thing, and with it, it's really starting to bring up the sustain of the drum and it's sort of starting to brick out that transient waveform, which is, I think, okay to do in sound design. I kind of like it. I think it sounds all right. And then channel EQ, taking out the sub elements and getting some of the high mid in there, well, those are really the highs, 10K. So brightening up the drum quite a bit. So what's going on at 200? You guys probably can guess it, but I'm making room preemptively for the snare drum. And this isn't really a sound design technique. It's more of a mix down thing. But the idea here is the snare drum's I know just from experience when I'm making this sound, is going to have a big spike at 200 because that's where I like them to hit really hard for a tune like this. And so even though the kick and the snare aren't typically firing at the same time in a drum and bass tune, unless you're doing a big build up or something, the kick and snare can be really frequency spectrum heavy, if you know what I mean. It means you can really make the sound just whenever the kick hits, it dominates the mix. Whenever the snare hits, it's really dominating the mix and it's kind of really punching through. But I find that making a hole at 200-ish for the snare is a good idea because it kind of empties the spectrum of the kick in that area so that when the snare hits, it sounds more dramatic. And I didn't figure this out. I read about this and I tried it, and it's like instantly kind of improved my mix downs, which I still don't like very much, but we had to start somewhere. And then also I'm dipping the low mids on this guy a little bit just to kind of not to make it a little less boxy. So if I turn the low mids up, kind of gets boxy, but just take a little bit out to clean that up a tiny bit. And then finally, the last plugin is Logic's Adaptive Limiter. And I apologize. Looks like this thing was peaking like crazy. I'm sorry about that. Check this out. So without the limiter and with. So you can see I'm using 15 whopping dB of gain reduction, which is typically frowned upon pretty heavily. But in this case, in a sound design sense, I'm using the limiter to kind of shape the one sound. And I'm breaking that kind of 3 dB rule or whatever by a lot. But I think it sounds good. I'm using the limiter as an effect to really beef the kick up. And I think that's one thing that I've had to learn is that if you're watching like a lot of YouTube tutorials, people have these rules of thumb like, don't run your limiters too hard and don't, your compressor should only be tickling the mix 2 or 3 dB. And those are probably, really good rules of thumb for mixing. But in my opinion, when you're doing sounds from scratch with the synthesizer, if it sounds good, it is good, and just go with it. And I thought the more I cranked this gain up, and at about this point, the kick really started to sound really solid, and it was kind of what I was after. So in any case, that's a little bit on how I made the kick, and in the next video, I'm going to talk about the snare. So I'll see you then.